The day Alice Garrison arrived in Dustcreek, Nevada, she had $3 sewn into the hem of her dress, a bruise yellowing along her jaw that she tried to hide beneath the brim of her bonnet, and the absolute certainty that she had made the worst mistake of her life. It was the autumn of 1879, and the town of Dustcreek sat like a copper penny forgotten in a crack between two mountain ranges, small and stubborn and sun-baked, the kind of place that did not ask where you came from because it already had enough of its own stories. The main road was packed dirt, iron-hard from the summer heat that had not yet fully surrendered to October, and it ran between a general store, a saloon called the Copper Pot, a livery stable, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of other buildings that leaned against each other the way tired men lean against fence posts. Alice stepped down from the stage with her carpetbag in one hand and the careful, measured stillness of a woman who had learned not to flinch in public. She was 24 years old, with dark hair pinned tightly at the back of her neck, hazel eyes that caught green in the sunlight, and a jaw set with the kind of quiet determination that comes not from confidence, but from having no other option available. She was not a fragile woman by any measure of the word, but she had been treated like something breakable for long enough that she had begun to believe it. She had come to Dustcreek for a job. Her cousin, Lena Marsh, had written to her back in Abilene 2 months prior, telling her that the schoolteacher position in Dustcreek had opened up, that the town council was willing to hire a woman if she had the proper references, and that the pay was $11 a month with a small room behind the schoolhouse included. $11 a month in a room of her own had sounded like salvation. She had packed her bag the same night the letter arrived and had not looked back once. That was not entirely true. She had looked back once, standing at the train depot in Abilene while her brother-in-law watched her with cold eyes from across the platform. She had looked back and seen the last 2 years of her life stretched out behind her like a long road she never intended to travel, and then she had turned around and climbed aboard the train. She had stayed with her sister, Margaret, and Margaret's husband, Calvin Howe, after their mother passed in the spring of 1877. Calvin had made it clear from the very first week that Alice was an imposition, a mouth to feed, and a body taking up space in his house. He had not been cruel in ways that left marks, not at first. He had been the kind of cruel that works slowly, that chips away at a person's sense of their own worth through small dismissals and sharp words, and the constant, grinding suggestion that everything that went wrong in the household was somehow connected to the fact that she was there at all. She had tried to earn her place. She had cooked and cleaned and taught the children their letters and taken in mending from neighbors to bring in a small income. None of it was ever quite enough. And then, 4 months ago, Calvin had struck her for the first time, an open-handed blow across the face that had sent her into the kitchen doorframe, and she had stood there in the ringing silence afterward and understood with perfect clarity that if she stayed, she would disappear entirely. So she had written to Lena, and Lena had written back. And here she stood in the thin October sunlight of Dustcreek, Nevada, with $3 and a bruise and the terrifying, dizzying feeling of standing at the beginning of something. The schoolhouse was easy enough to find. Lena met her there with a warm embrace and a pot of coffee and the kind of welcome that made Alice's eyes sting with something she was too tired to call by its proper name. Lena was 31, sturdy and practical, married to a man named Harold Marsh who ran the general store and who wore the expression of someone permanently mildly confused but perpetually willing to help. They fed Alice supper and showed her the little room behind the school, which had a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over a stretch of open range that turned purple and gold in the evening light. And Alice sat on the edge of that narrow bed and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Something like being safe. She started teaching on a Monday, 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, a schoolroom with a pot-bellied stove and uneven floorboards and a chalkboard that had seen better decades. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. Children responded to her because she spoke to them plainly and listened to them seriously and made them feel, each one of them, as though their particular understanding of the world mattered. By the end of the first week, she had them in a reasonable routine, and by the end of the second, she knew all their names and most of their histories, which ones had lost parents to disease or accident, which ones had fathers who worked the mines to the north, which ones came to school hungry and needed a biscuit tucked quietly into their pocket before the morning lessons began. She had been in Dustcreek for 3 weeks when she first truly noticed Daniel Garrett. She had seen him before, certainly. In a town of Dustcreek's size, you saw everyone within the first few days, whether you meant to or not. He was not a man who was easy to overlook. He stood a little over 6 feet, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who do hard work outdoors, with dark blonde hair that tended toward the color of old wheat and eyes that were a clear, steady gray. He was 28 years old and he ran a cattle ranch about 4 miles east of town, a spread called the Double G that he had built from almost nothing over the past 5 years. He wore his hat low against the sun and moved with the unhurried ease of a man who was comfortable in his body and his world, but not arrogant about it. The first real conversation they had came about through the most ordinary possible circumstance. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Alice had stayed late to work on the week's lesson plans, and when she finally came out of the schoolhouse, she found that the wind had picked up sharply from the north and scattered 3 weeks' worth of written work across the yard. She had let the papers dry on the fence after the children had copied their multiplication tables, and now they were tumbling across the dirt in every direction like pale birds. She dropped her bag and ran after them without thinking, which was how she found herself in the middle of the road on her hands and knees picking up sheets of paper, while the wind did its absolute level best to undo every effort she made. She had gathered perhaps a third of them when a pair of worn boots appeared in her field of vision, and then a large, work-roughened hand came into view holding a substantial stack of recovered papers. She looked up. Daniel Garrett was looking down at her with an expression that was not pity and not amusement, but something quietly good-humored that she found, to her mild surprise, not irritating in the least. "Wind's got a mean streak today," he said. It was a simple thing to say, a nothing sort of observation, but he said it in a way that invited rather than dismissed, and Alice took the papers from his hand and stood up and said, "It seems to have a personal opinion about multiplication." He blinked and then he smiled, and it changed his whole face in a way that was somewhat startling in its warmth. "You must be the new school teacher." "Alice Garrison," she said. "Daniel Garrett," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Double G Ranch east of town. I've got a nephew among your students, Tommy Garrett. He's my brother James's boy. James passed 2 years ago, so Tommy lives out at the ranch with me." "Tommy is a very bright boy," Alice said, and she meant it completely. "He has a remarkable memory and an excellent instinct for figures." Something moved across Daniel's face at that, something careful and grateful, and he said, "He'll be glad to hear it. He worries he's not keeping up." "He's leading the way most days," Alice said. They stood there in the road with the wind pulling at her hair and the papers stacked carefully between them, and the conversation might have ended there, politely and forgettably. But then old Henderson's gray cat came tearing around the corner of the livery in a state of apparent catastrophe, shot between Alice's feet, and sent the papers exploding into the air again. And Daniel said with that same quiet amusement, "Round 2, and they both chased papers through the wind for the next 10 minutes. And by the time they had gathered every last one, Alice was laughing in spite of herself, genuinely laughing. And she realized with a small shock that she could not remember the last time she had done that. He helped her carry them back into the schoolhouse, and she weighted them down with books, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I hope Dustcreek is treating you well so far, Miss Garrison." And she said, "It has been very kind to me," and both things were true. He came back the following Saturday with Tommy in tow, the boy clutching a copy of his arithmetic work that he had redone voluntarily because he had not been satisfied with his first effort. Alice answered a question Tommy had about fractions while Daniel leaned against the doorframe and listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. And when Tommy ran off to help Harold Marsh load grain sacks as he had apparently promised, Daniel asked if he could walk with her a short distance since he was heading toward the general store anyway. They walked along the main road in the October afternoon and talked, not about anything of great consequence, about the weather and the ranch, and whether she had found the altitude difficult to adjust to after the flatlands of Kansas. She had grown up in Abilene. He had grown up in Missouri before heading west at 21 with his brother James, both of them with $30 between them and a plan that was more hope than substance. He talked about James without flinching, with the steady honesty of someone who has grieved a loss fully and learned to carry it rather than set it down. He was kicked by a horse, Daniel said. It was fast. He didn't suffer. He paused. Tommy was 5. He doesn't remember much. Sometimes I think that's a mercy and sometimes I think it's another kind of sadness. I think it can be both, Alice said quietly. He looked at her sideways, just a quick, assessing glance, and then he nodded slowly. Yes, he said. I think you're right. There was something between them from those first conversations, something Alice recognized but did not trust, because she had learned through careful, painful experience that her own instincts about people could be wrong. She had trusted Calvin once, had thought he was a solid man, a good man, and she had been badly mistaken, so she cataloged what she knew of Daniel Garrett with deliberate care. He was respected in Dustcreek, not merely liked but genuinely respected, which was a different thing. He paid his debts promptly, and his hired hands stayed with him year after year, which meant something. He took Tommy to school every day without fail, even during calving season when his time was at its scarcest. He spoke to women, to Lena and to Clara at the general store, and to Mrs. Birch at the church, with the same straightforward courtesy he used with everyone else, not condescension, not performance. She watched and she waited, and she kept her distance in the careful way of someone who has learned that distance is the only reliable protection. November came in cold and honest, a bite in the air that made the stars look brittle and the mornings feel like iron. Alice settled into the rhythm of the town with increasing ease. She attended the Sunday service at the little church and found that she liked the minister, a weathered man named Reverend Calloway who kept his sermons short and his compassion long. She took her supper with Lena and Harold twice a week and developed a habit of evening walks along the edge of town, where the range opened up and the sky turned colors she had not seen in Abilene, violent purples and deep, burning oranges that made her feel at once very small and strangely glad to be alive. Tommy Garrett was in her schoolroom every day, bright-eyed and earnest, and occasionally wearing his hat indoors until she caught him at it, which made him grin and remove it without embarrassment. He talked about his uncle with easy affection, the way children talk about people who are the bedrock of their world. Uncle Daniel fixed the corral fence in the dark because it had to be done before morning. Uncle Daniel made biscuits on Sundays even though they were terrible. Tommy said this without malice, and he always made them anyway because James used to make them and he was trying to learn. Uncle Daniel had kept a letter James wrote before he died and read it to Tommy every year on Tommy's birthday, because James had written about the man he hoped his son would grow up to be. Alice heard these things and filed them away and tried not to feel the way they made her feel. The incident that changed everything happened on a Friday evening in the second week of November. Alice had gone to the Copperpot not to drink, but because Lena had asked her to bring Harold's forgotten supper pail, which had somehow ended up in the saloon's back room after Harold had helped move furniture for the owner, a broad, cheerful man named Pete Colvin. She was in and out in less than 10 minutes, but 10 minutes was long enough for two things to happen. The first was that she ran into Marjorie Dawes, the wife of the town's only doctor, a woman who had appointed herself the chief recorder of Dustcreek's social landscape, and who had a particular gift for asking questions that were really comments. "Miss Garrison," Marjorie said, catching her near the door with the unerring instinct of the dedicated gossip. "I was just saying to Helen Birch that I could not imagine what it must be like to have come all this way on your own. No family to speak of. No prospects." Alice held the supper pail and kept her face pleasant and said, "I have my work, Mrs. Dawes, and I find it very rewarding." Of course. And your people in Abilene. Was it difficult to leave them behind?" "Not particularly," Alice said, which was true, and which Marjorie clearly found unsatisfying. "I heard you were staying with your cousin Lena. Such a relief to have someone take you in." Alice felt the familiar contraction, that old tightening in her chest that said you are a burden. You are a weight people carry because they are kind and not because you deserve it, and she pressed her lips together briefly and said, "Lena and Harold have been very welcoming. If you'll excuse me." She stepped out into the cold evening and was halfway down the boardwalk before she heard Daniel's voice behind her. "Miss Garrison, are you all right?" She turned. He had been coming out of the general store across the road and had evidently witnessed at least part of the exchange through the window of the copperpot, because he was looking at her with an expression of quiet concern that had nothing performative about it. "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was mostly true. He crossed the road toward her and stopped a few feet away, reading her face with those steady gray eyes, and then he said, very simply, "Marjorie Dawes has the conversational instincts of a rattlesnake." "I wouldn't take anything she says too deeply to heart." Alice let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I don't," she said. "But it landed somewhere," he said, not pressing, just observing. She looked at him. He was not pushing for anything. He was simply standing in the cold evening air being honest, and she found she could not quite maintain the careful composure she had been wearing all week. "It's a particular talent of hers," Alice said, "to say the things that are already sitting in the back of your own mind." He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "What things?" he asked, and there was nothing invasive in the question, only a genuine and careful attention. She looked out at the street, at the cold November dark settling over Dustcreek, and she said, without quite intending to say it, that I am someone else's difficulty, that the people around me would be easier without me in the picture. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He let it sit for a moment, as though he was taking what she had said seriously enough not to rush past it with a quick denial. "Who told you that?" he said. She looked back at him. "No one had to tell me," she said. "It was made plain enough, by someone back in Abilene." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not quite read, something that was not pity but was not neutral either, something closer to the kind of controlled anger a person feels when they learn that someone they have come to regard as worth caring about has been treated as though they were not. "I think," he said, choosing his words with evident care, "that whoever showed you that particular picture was working with a flawed mirror." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he touched the brim of his hat and said good evening and continued on his way, and Alice stood on the boardwalk in the cold for a long moment afterward with the supper pail in her hand, and something she could not name turning quietly in her chest. She told Lena about it later, sitting by Lena's kitchen fire with cups of tea warming their hands. Lena listened with the careful silence of someone who knows when to let a person talk. "He said that," Lena said when Alice had finished. "He said whoever showed me that picture was working with a flawed mirror," Alice confirmed. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel Garrett is a good man, Alice. He is genuinely, thoroughly good in the way that does not need anyone's attention to sustain it." "I know he is," Alice said, "and you like him." "I find him very easy to talk to," Alice said carefully. Lena smiled into her tea and did not press any further, which was one of the many reasons Alice loved her. Daniel came to the schoolhouse on the following Tuesday with Tommy and a crate of firewood, because he had heard from Harold that the delivery had been short, and the schoolhouse stove was running through the existing supply too fast. He carried the wood in himself and stacked it by the stove while the children watched with open interest, and Tommy pretended to be only mildly invested, which fooled no one. Daniel thanked Alice for the lesson she had given on state capitals the previous week, which Tommy had apparently reproduced at the supper table with considerable accuracy, and Alice thanked him for the wood, and they were polite and careful with each other in the way of two people who are aware that something is happening between them and are not yet sure what to do with that awareness. He started coming by the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons to collect Tommy, arriving a little early so that there was time to talk once the other children had gone. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the ranch, about the particular challenges and satisfactions of running cattle in the Nevada high country, the brutal winters and the brief, extravagant springs. She told him about growing up in Abilene, about her mother, who had been a teacher herself and who had read aloud every evening until the last, about the prairie wind that she had hated as a girl and now missed with a specificity that surprised her. She did not tell him about Calvin. She was not ready to hand that part of herself over to anyone, and she was wise enough about her own defenses to know that the impulse to share it would come from trust and not from pressure, from her own decision and not from being maneuvered into it. What she told him instead, bit by bit over those Friday afternoons, was the truth of who she was below the careful composure, that she was stubborn about things she believed in and flexible about almost everything else, that she cried at the wrong times, at books and sunsets, and not at funerals, not until much later when she was alone, that she had a temper she had learned to keep contained, but which did not stay contained when a child was being treated unfairly, that she found the Nevada sky almost unbearable in its beauty, and that she was slowly, tentatively beginning to feel at home. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention she had come to associate exclusively with him, as though whatever she was saying was the thing he had most wanted to hear. He did not fill silences unnecessarily. He did not correct her or minimize her or redirect the conversation to himself. He was simply present in a way she had not encountered before in a man, a way that made her feel, for the first time in a very long time, as though occupying space in the world was not an imposition. December arrived and brought the first real snow of the season, a heavy, serious fall that kept the school closed for 2 days and turned Dustcreek into something almost beautiful under its white cover. Alice spent the snow days in her room behind the schoolhouse wrapped in the quilt Lena had given her, reading and planning lessons, and watching the range turn white and vast and still through her window. On the second day, she heard a knock at the schoolhouse door and opened it to find Daniel standing on the step with a covered pot of soup and Tommy grinning behind him like sunrise. Tommy was worried about the stove, Daniel said, and he said it as easily as breathing, as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do, as though driving 4 miles through the snow with a pot of soup was simply what a person did. She let them in and found 3 bowls, and they sat together at one of the children's tables, all 3 of them slightly too large for the small chairs. And Tommy told her about the calf that had been born in the middle of the snowstorm and been carried into the barn and was now sleeping in the hay. And Daniel watched his nephew talk with the steady, comfortable love of a man who had been both uncle and father long enough that the 2 roles had merged into something seamlessly his own. She caught Daniel watching her once, just a flicker, when Tommy was deep in describing the color of the calf's markings. He looked away when she caught it, but not quickly and not guiltily. Just steadily, like a man who has seen something true. She started to think about what it would mean to trust him. Not in the abstract, theoretical way she had been considering it for weeks, but in the concrete, specific way of a woman who recognizes that her heart is moving in a particular direction and is trying to decide whether to walk with it or turn around. She thought about Calvin, about the slow erosion of her own sense of self over 2 years, about the way she had begun to believe the version of herself she saw in his eyes, insufficient and costly and difficult to love. She thought about how long it had taken her to leave, how she had stood at the door of her own conviction for months before she walked through it, and she wondered if that kind of damage left a permanent scar or whether scars could be something other than a limitation. The answer came to her not in a dramatic moment of revelation, but in a quiet conversation in late December, on a Friday afternoon when Tommy had run ahead to the store, and she and Daniel were walking along the edge of town in the cold, clear air. And she said, without planning to say it, without any particular preamble, "I left Abilene because the man my sister married had decided I was a burden." For 2 years he made that very clear, and for 2 years I believed him. She said it flat and plain, the way she had taught herself to say difficult things, without apology and without dramatics, because she had learned that both of those tended to make the listener respond to the delivery rather than the content. She said it, and then she waited. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. They kept walking. The snow crunched under their boots, and the last light of the afternoon turned the mountains at the edge of the valley gold and pink, and the air smelled like cold and pine. Then he stopped walking and turned to face her, and he said, "That was his failure, not yours. Not even a little bit yours." She held his gaze. "I know that now most days. What about the other days?" She looked away toward the mountains. "The other days I have to remind myself." "Then I'll remind you," he said. It was said simply, without drama or flourish, the way he said most things. But the simplicity of it was what undid her, because it was not a promise made for the sake of making it. It was a statement of intent. A declaration in the quiet language of a man who did not say things he did not mean. She looked back at him, and the thing she saw in his face was not pity and not admiration, and not the complicated calculation of a man trying to work out what he can get. It was something far more disarming than any of those. It was recognition, the steady, serious attention of someone who sees what is actually there. She felt something give way in her chest, some load-bearing structure of self-protection that had been holding for a very long time, and she felt it go without panic, which surprised her. "You're going to make things very difficult for me," she said quietly. "How's that?" he asked, and there was a warmth in the question, the beginning of a smile. "I had a very sensible plan to keep an appropriate distance from everyone in this town until I was certain I wasn't making any more mistakes." He was fully smiling now. "And I'm interfering with that plan." "Considerably," she said. "Good," he said, and then, almost immediately, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said it like that. What I mean is that I'd rather have the chance to be worth trusting than to have you decide in advance that no one is." She looked at him for a long moment in the fading afternoon light, this man who drove through snowstorms with soup and stacked firewood and read his dead brother's letter aloud to a little boy every year on his birthday, and she made a decision. "Walk with me again tomorrow," she said. His smile came back, quieter this time, and he said, "Every day if you'll have me." They did not rush. That was the thing about it that Alice found most remarkable and most healing, the pace of it. There was no pressure, no urgency, no sense that she was being moved toward something she had not chosen. They walked together and talked together and sat together at Lena's Sunday suppers, where Harold poured cider and the conversation was warm and unhurried, and Tommy provided running commentary on everything from the quality of the biscuits to the specific injustice of early bedtimes. They went to the Christmas service at the little church together, the three of them, and afterward they stood in the cold outside under a sky so thick with stars it looked like something you could reach up and touch. And Tommy, who was 7 and therefore had very little patience with the complicated things adults did instead of simply saying what they meant, said, "You should hold her hand, Uncle Daniel. It's cold." And Alice laughed and Daniel took her hand, and that was that. He held her hand walking back to the schoolhouse and did not let go until they reached the door. And then he said good night and looked at her in the starlight with those gray eyes that she had come to regard as one of the most reliable things she had ever encountered. And she said good night and went inside and stood in the dark for a moment, just being still. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know something that has been true for a while before you name it. The way you suddenly notice a sound that you realize has been present for a long time. She was falling in love with Daniel Garrett, and the extraordinary, specific thing about it was that it did not frighten her the way she had expected it to. He asked her to the New Year's dance at the Copperpot on a Tuesday morning when he stopped by the schoolhouse with Tommy's forgotten arithmetic workbook, asking with his hat in his hands and a directness that was not at all uncertain but was deeply sincere. She said yes before he finished the question, which made him blink and then smile in that way that changed his whole face. The dance was the first day of January, 1880, and Dustcreek put on a reasonable affair, Pete Colvin having pushed the tables back and hired 2 fiddlers from the mining camp to the north, who turned out to be genuinely excellent. Alice wore the dress she had been saving, a deep blue wool that was not fancy but was the best she had, and Lena helped her with her hair, piling it up and coaxing a few curls loose around her face, and Alice looked at herself in Lena's mirror and felt, with a quiet and genuine surprise, that she looked like herself. Not like the diminished version of herself she had carried around for 2 years in Abilene, like her actual self. Daniel was waiting at the door of the Copperpot when she arrived with Lena and Harold, and when he saw her he went very still for just a moment, the way a person does when they see something that stops them, and then he walked toward her with a quiet certainty that made her heart do something she had not felt in years. He offered his arm and she took it, and he said, very quietly near her ear, "You look beautiful, Alice." And she said, equally quietly, "You look like you cleaned up for the occasion." And he laughed, low and warm. They danced 3 times, which by the social mathematics of a small frontier town in 1880 was a declaration. The fiddles played and the floor was full, and Marjorie Dawes watched from the corner, with an expression that Alice met directly and pleasantly, and without flinching. Tommy had been allowed to stay up past his usual hour, and sat on a barrel near the musicians watching the dancing with the critical attention of someone taking notes. And at one point, Daniel spun Alice out and brought her back in, and she was laughing, genuinely and fully laughing. And she looked up at him and found him looking down at her with something in his face that was so entirely uncomplicated in its warmth that it made her breath catch. Between the second and third dance, they stood together near the wall with cups of cider, and he told her something he had been working up to for a while. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to know I'm not saying it because I want anything in return or because I'm trying to move things faster than they should go. I'm saying it because it's true and because I've been thinking about it for a while, and it seems like the kind of thing that should be said out loud." She waited. "I think you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever met," he said. "Not because of anything dramatic or because your life has been difficult, though it has, but because of the way you are. The way you talk to children as though their thoughts matter. The way you said that grief can be both a mercy and a sadness, and you were exactly right. The way you told me what you told me about Abilene without asking for anything, not sympathy, not reassurance, just being honest because you are an honest person. I have not met many people who are honest that way." He paused. "I'm not in the habit of saying things like this, but I thought you should know it." The fiddles started up again. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're making it very hard to maintain any sort of composure," she said at last. "Good," he said again, with a grin this time, and she shook her head and took his hand and pulled him back onto the floor. January was cold and blue, and the days were short, and she counted the hours until Friday afternoons with a regularity that would have embarrassed her to admit. He brought her books from the traveling merchant who came through twice a month. She brought biscuits to the ranch on a Saturday, her own recipe, which Tommy declared objectively superior to Daniel's, a judgment Daniel accepted with philosophical equanimity. She met his ranch hands, 2 brothers named Cal and Pete Osgood, who had worked the Double G for 3 years, and received her with the easy friendliness of men who took their cue from their employer, and found his opinion of her persuasion enough. She saw what the ranch was. She understood what he had built. Not just the land and the cattle and the buildings. though those were real and solid achievements in their own right. But the thing underneath all of it, the particular quality of a life lived with consistency and care, a life that had room in it for grief and hard work and the small, daily effort of raising a boy to be a good man. She thought about her own life, about what she was building in Dustcreek, about the 14 children who came to her schoolroom every morning and left every afternoon a little fuller, and she thought that these two things, what he had built and what she was building, were not incompatible. They were, in fact, the kind of things that might hold together very well. It was a Sunday afternoon in early February when he asked her. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, which was a substantial building of good timber, solid and well-made, with a view across the range that on clear days extended all the way to the blue suggestion of the distant Humboldt Mountains. There was still snow on the peaks, and the air was cold, but the sun was out, and they were both wrapped in coats, and the afternoon had the particular quality of winter light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. Tommy was inside reading, which he had recently discovered he liked very much, having gone through both of the adventure books Alice had given him, and moved on to a natural history volume that he was reading with the same intense focus he brought to arithmetic. Daniel was quiet for a longer while than usual, which she had learned to recognize as his way when he was thinking carefully about something. She waited, watching a hawk turn slow circles above the far pasture. "Alice," he said at last, and the way he said her name had a weight to it that she recognized. She turned to look at him. He was looking at his hands briefly, the way a man does when he is gathering himself, and then he looked at her directly. "I have been trying to think of a way to say this that is not clumsy," he said. "I don't think I've found one, so I'm just going to say it and trust that you know by now that I mean it properly." "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I love you, Alice. I am not entirely certain when it happened, but I am certain that it's true. And I know your history, and I know what was done to your confidence, and I know you have been careful, and I think you were right to be careful. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, but I wanted you to know where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment in the February sunlight, this steady, careful, good man who drove through snowstorms and read letters to little boys, and said the right things not because he had calculated the right things, but because he thought about people the way they deserved to be thought about. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting to be sure enough to say it without flinching." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and his hand was warm and large and certain, and they sat together on the porch in the winter sun for a long time without saying anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in late March, which was not a particularly dramatic day in any other respect. The snow was melting off the range, and the first green was showing in the lower pastures, and the sky was the particular sharp blue of early Nevada spring. He came to the schoolhouse at the end of the day after the children had gone, and he had his hat in his hands, and he was not nervous in the visible, performative way of men who have rehearsed, but there was a seriousness in him that she recognized as care. "I know this is not a small thing," he said, "and I know that the last 2 years before you came here were hard in ways that have left marks. I'm not asking you to forget any of that. I'm asking if you'll let me be the person who stands beside you for the rest of it. All of it. The teaching and the biscuit arguments and the arguments about other things too, because we're both stubborn and I don't expect that to be smooth every day. I'm asking if you'll marry me." She had thought about this. She had thought about it with the full, careful, honest attention she brought to everything that mattered. She had thought about what it meant to trust, about what it meant to choose, about the difference between deciding to love someone because they were safe and deciding to love someone because they were true. He was true. She had tested that not deliberately, not in any manipulative way, but in the organic, accumulated way of two people spending enough time together that the performance eventually either fails or reveals itself as no performance at all. He was exactly who he appeared to be, all the way down. "Yes," she said. I will marry you." The smile that crossed his face was the one she loved best, the full one, the one that changed his whole expression and reached his eyes entirely. He took her hand and held it, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what it felt like to stand in your own life without apologizing for being there. They were married on a Saturday in the first week of May, in the little church with the crooked steeple, by Reverend Calloway, who kept his remarks brief and warm and personal. Lena stood beside Alice, and Harold stood beside Daniel, and Tommy stood in the front row in his good suit with his hair pressed flat, and an expression of profound satisfaction, as though everything had gone according to a plan he had been managing from the beginning. The ceremony was simple, and it was real. Alice had found, in the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, that she had no desire for ceremony for its own sake, no need for anything that was not genuine. What she wanted was to stand in front of the people she had come to care for, and say the words she meant and look at the man she was saying them to, and know they were true. She wore a cream-colored dress that Lena and 3 other women in town had helped her make, with small embroidered flowers at the collar that had been her mother's doing, transferred from an old dress that was beyond wearing but too precious to discard. She carried a handful of the first wildflowers of spring that Tommy had collected from the edge of the ranch road that morning, and presented to her outside the church with a formality that was 7-year-old's earnest best attempt at a proper gesture. She cried when Daniel said his vows, not from grief, not from the complicated reasons she usually cried, but from something clean and bright that rose up in her without warning and overflowed. He noticed, and he smiled, that quiet, private smile that was hers, and he said his words steadily and clearly in the way he said everything that mattered. They had a celebration at Lena and Harold's house afterward, with food and cider, and the 2 fiddlers from the mining camp again. And the evening was warm enough to be outside, and the stars came out early, and the mountains stood at the edge of the dark range like old watchmen. Tommy fell asleep in a chair at some point, and Daniel carried him to the spare room, and when he came back outside and found Alice sitting on the porch step with her shoes off and her head tipped back looking at the stars, he sat down beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of something that has always been true. She moved her things to the ranch the following week. Her room behind the schoolhouse was handed over to the next term's use, though she continued teaching, because the town council had agreed, after a brief and not entirely comfortable negotiation in which Alice had been very clear about her intentions, that a married woman could continue to hold the teaching position. It was not the usual arrangement. Alice had made the case directly and without apology, and Daniel had sat beside her in that council meeting with the expression of a man who would back her up entirely, and did not anticipate being needed, because he thought she was entirely capable of handling it herself, which was both accurate and one of the things she loved most about him. She taught, and she came home to the ranch in the evenings, and the 2 worlds, the schoolroom and the wide sweep of the Double G, fitted together in a way she had not quite allowed herself to imagine before it happened. She walked the morning into the kitchen and made coffee, and looked out the window at the range turning gold in the early light, and felt something she was willing now to call happiness without qualifications. Tommy adjusted to the new arrangement with the adaptability of children and the particular enthusiasm of a boy who had wanted this outcome for some time. He was at turns very dignified about it and openly delighted, sometimes within the same hour. He helped carry Alice's books from the wagon and arranged them with great seriousness on the shelf in the sitting room, and then ran outside to tell the ranch dogs about the development, which Daniel observed from the doorway with an expression of deep affection. The spring and summer of 1880 unfolded with the particular fullness of a time you are aware is good while you are in it, which is rarer and more valuable than most people acknowledge. The cattle were healthy, and the grazing was good, and the Double G had a strong season. Alice's students made excellent progress, and she added 2 more students in June, children of a family who had settled on a claim 6 miles north. a brother and sister named Ada and Marcus Webb who were quiet and sharp, and who attached themselves to Alice's classroom with the intensity of children who have been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of attention. She and Daniel fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that still, months in, occasionally struck her as something she had not expected. Not because she had doubted him, but because she had doubted herself for so long that the absence of that particular doubt felt like new territory. She was no longer assessing her right to be present. She was simply present. She said what she thought. She took up space. She argued with him about the best route for the new fence line and about whether Tommy needed a horse of his own this year or could wait another year, and these arguments were real arguments between equals, and he listened to her and she listened to him, and sometimes he was right and sometimes she was right, and the world did not end either way. There were hard days. Days when the old weight settled back on her, and she heard Calvin's voice in some distant part of her head saying things about her worth that were not true and had never been true, but that had been said often enough to have left a groove. On those days, she was sometimes quiet in a way Daniel recognized, and he did not demand to know the reason or attempt to fix it with words. He simply stayed close and made sure she knew he was there, and when she was ready to talk she did, and when she was not he did not press her. That quality in him, the patience of it, the specific and deliberate respect of it, was as important to her healing as any other thing. She told him the full story of Calvin one evening in July, sitting on the porch after Tommy was in bed, in the warm dark with the sound of the range around them. She told him all of it, not the edited version she had given in pieces, but the complete account, the slow erosion and the long silence and the blow that had finally clarified everything. She told it without apology and without performance, and she watched his face while she told it. He was very controlled. She could see the controlled quality of it, the effort it took to simply listen and not react in ways that would shift the story away from her. His jaw was tight and his hands were still on the arms of the chair, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "He should not have touched you," he said at last. "Not once, not ever." He paused. "I'm glad you left." "I'm glad I left too," she said. He reached over and took her hand and held it. "You've never been anyone's burden, Alice, not for a single day of your life." She felt the truth of it in a way she had not quite felt it before, not in all the months of knowing it intellectually. She felt it land in the place where the old damage lived and settle there like something warm. "I know," she said, and she did. In September of 1880 she realized, quietly and with a certainty that built itself from small, unmistakable signals, that she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for a few days, holding it carefully, testing her own feelings about it, finding them complex and layered, and ultimately, underneath everything, deeply glad. She told Daniel on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen with the coffee between them and the early light coming through the window, and she watched his face go through something swift and extraordinary, surprise and then a joy so complete it looked almost like astonishment at itself. He came around the table and took her face in both his hands very gently and looked at her for a moment, and then he kissed her, and she felt the joy in it, the specific, irreducible joy of this man, this life, this morning. "Are you all right?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, not anything about himself or his own feeling, but whether she was all right. "I am better than all right," she said honestly. "A baby," he said, and she could hear the wonder in it. "Come spring, if I'm calculating correctly," she said. Tommy was told the following evening, and received the news with the particular complexity of a child processing a shift in the understood geography of his world. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said with great deliberation, "I'll be the older one." "You will," Daniel confirmed. "I can teach it things," Tommy said. "You will be an excellent teacher," Alice said, meaning it entirely. Tommy thought about this and then nodded, apparently having reached a satisfactory conclusion, and asked if he could have more stew. The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. The first months were hard in the way that first months tend to be. A persistent nausea that made mornings challenging, and a fatigue that was unlike ordinary tiredness. She continued teaching through the fall, adjusting as needed, and the women of Dustcreek, led largely by Lena and including even Marjorie Dawes, who had apparently decided that Alice was now worth being kind to, formed around her with the practical, unsentimental care of frontier women who understood that life was hard and that helping each other was not sentiment but necessity. Daniel was magnificent. There was no other word for it. He was present and practical and steadfast, and he did not treat her as though she had become breakable, which she had feared and which would have been intolerable. He treated her as what she was, a capable woman navigating a demanding physical experience, and he gave her support without erasing her agency. He learned to make the food she could tolerate, and to stay up with her when sleep would not come, and to sit with her in the early mornings when she felt worst without trying to talk her through it, simply being a presence that said, "You are not alone in this." She stopped teaching in January of 1881, 2 months before her time, because the swell of her belly and the state of her back made the long walk and the hours on her feet more than she could comfortably manage. She handed her classroom to a temporary teacher the council brought from Carson City, a sensible young woman named Frances Good, who promised to follow Alice's lesson plans exactly and kept her word. The winter was the long kind, with snow that sat and stayed and made the world very still and very white. Alice spent the weeks reading and sewing and keeping accounts for the ranch in the evenings, a task she had taken on because she had a good head for figures, and because it gave her something useful to do, and because it turned out that Daniel's bookkeeping, while earnest, was not his strongest skill. He admitted this without embarrassment, and she reorganized 3 years' worth of ledgers with a satisfaction that he observed with fond amusement. "I would have been in considerable financial difficulty if I hadn't married you," he said one evening, watching her work. "You would have figured it out eventually," she said without looking up. "Probably not," he said cheerfully. Their son was born on a night in early March of 1881, after a long and exhausting labor that Lena and the doctor's wife attended with steady competence, while Daniel waited in the next room in the particular torment of men who cannot help and know it. When the baby's cry finally came through the wall, Alice heard the long exhale from the other room, a sound of relief so complete it was almost tangible. They named him James Daniel Garrett for his uncle. It had been Alice's suggestion, offered quietly one evening in November, and Daniel had gone very still when she said it and then nodded, and the look on his face had been something she would carry for the rest of her life. She held James in the early hours of the morning, with the lamp burning low and Daniel sitting beside her on the bed with his arm around her, and Tommy asleep in the chair in the corner, where he had refused to leave once the waiting was over. She looked at this child, this new person, this small and complete and entirely himself creature, and felt the complete and final dismantling of the last of the old weight. She was not a burden. She had never been a burden. She was a woman with a life that was hers, a life she had chosen and built and defended and filled with real things, with learning and love and this small, extraordinary new person in her arms. She was a woman who had been picked up, piece by careful piece, without drama and without condition, by a man who had simply decided that she was worth it without ever needing her to earn the decision. She looked at Daniel and he looked back at her, and James made a small, emphatic sound that made Tommy stir in his chair, and she said very quietly, "We have a family." "We have a family," he said. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect because no years are, but genuinely, substantively good in the ways that matter. James grew into a child of considerable personality, loud and curious and fearless in a way that kept everyone in his vicinity in a state of alert attention. Tommy, who was 14 when James took his first steps, turned out to be an exceptional older brother, patient and genuinely delighted in the way of older children who were wanted in their role rather than merely assigned it. Alice went back to teaching the following autumn when James was 6 months old, and Lena offered to take him during school hours, an arrangement that worked with remarkable smoothness, because James was a sociable infant who found Harold's General Store a perfectly adequate substitute for anywhere else. The schoolroom felt like returning to something essential, not because home was not also essential, but because both were, and that was the truth she had finally learned to hold without apology. She taught for 3 more years in Dustcreek before the school grew large enough to require a second teacher, at which point Alice took the older students and Frances Good, who had been offered and had accepted a permanent position, took the younger ones. They became close collaborators and, eventually, genuine friends, a friendship of the easy, intellectually satisfying kind that Alice had not had since childhood. There were changes in Dustcreek in those years, as there were changes everywhere in the Nevada Territory in the early 1880s. The railroad line was extended, bringing more settlers and more commerce, and the town grew by degrees, adding a hotel and a second saloon and a proper doctor's office when old Dr. Dawes retired. The mining activity to the north fluctuated with the prices and the veins, and some families arrived and some departed, and the permanent population of Dustcreek developed the settled, particular character of a community that has decided to last. The Double G grew steadily. Daniel added pasture and cattle with the methodical ambition of a man who plans carefully and executes patiently, and the ranch became one of the strongest operations in that part of the county. He hired 2 more hands and promoted Cal Osgood to foreman, a decision Cal received with the expression of a man who had hoped for it for years, and was not about to betray that by being visibly moved. Pete Osgood threw his hat in the air. The ranch became something Alice understood more fully with each passing year, not just as the place she lived, but as the product of a particular kind of sustained care, the kind that does not make headlines but makes lives. In the summer of 1884, when James was 3 and Tommy was nearly 17 and beginning to talk about what came next with the complicated urgency of a boy standing at the edge of adulthood, Alice discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Daniel in the same kitchen, the same morning light, the same coffee, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that swift, complete, astonished joy, and she kissed him this time before he could say anything. This pregnancy was easier in the early months but harder in the later ones, a reversal of the first that the doctor explained was perfectly common and meant nothing in particular. She slowed down earlier and let herself be slowed down with less resistance than the first time, which she recognized as its own kind of progress. She trusted her body, and she trusted the people around her, and she trusted the knowledge she had accumulated through experience, and the combination of those 3 things made a difficult thing manageable. Their daughter, Eleanor Margaret Garrett, was born in December of 1884, in the same room where James had come into the world, with the same doctor and Lena and the December dark outside and the stove burning high. She was named for her grandmother, Alice's mother, and for Lena, whose middle name was Margaret. Daniel held her in the first minutes, this tiny girl with dark hair and the squinting, concentrated expression of someone making serious assessments, and he looked at Alice over the baby's head, with an expression that was not possible to adequately describe in words, but that Alice memorized completely and kept. James, 3 years old and accustomed to being the center of the universe, considered Eleanor for a long and serious time, and then declared that she was very small and asked if she would get bigger. He was assured that she would. He accepted this and attempted to give her a wooden horse, which she was not yet in any position to appreciate, and was not discouraged by this. Tommy, 17 by then and full of the particular intensity of a young man forming his sense of who he intended to be, held Eleanor with the careful, moved sincerity of an older brother who had grown up understanding what family meant in its real, chosen form. He looked at Daniel and said, quietly, "James would have loved this," and Daniel said, "Yes." He would have, and they held that between them for a moment, the acknowledgement of the person whose absence shaped the love that filled this room. And then Alina made a sound of great purpose, and the moment passed into the ongoing fabric of the life. Tommy decided when he was 18 that he wanted to go to school in Carson City, to study law, a decision he had been building toward for 2 years and announced with the resolved directness of someone who has thought a thing through thoroughly. Daniel and Alice listened to him make his case, which was thorough and well-reasoned, and then Daniel said that he thought it was an excellent idea, and Alice said she had been expecting it, and Tommy blinked and said, "You both knew." And they said they had had a fairly clear sense of it, and Tommy laughed, and it was the laugh of someone who has never really doubted that he was loved. He left for Carson City in the autumn of 1886, 18 years old and serious and ready, with his trunk and his books and a letter from Alice with references she had written to 2 lawyers she had come to know through the school board. And he came home for Christmas and Easter and summers, and he was always, when he walked back through the door of the Double G, unambiguously and entirely home. The years settled into their shape. James grew into a compact, energetic boy of strong opinions and natural leadership, the kind of child who organized games and took care to ensure everyone had a role, and was constitutionally incapable of sitting still for longer than was strictly necessary. He was interested in the ranch in a way that was practically expressed, helping with chores from young ages with a competence that made the hands grin, and he was also, to his own occasional surprise, a good student, particularly in geography and history, subjects that engaged the part of him that wanted to know how the world fit together. Alina was different in temperament, quieter and more interior, a child who listened first and spoke with careful precision, and who could focus on a single thing for extraordinary lengths of time. She loved books and she loved the horses, and she had Alice's hazel eyes and Daniel's steadiness, a combination that expressed itself in a child who seemed, from very young, to have an internal compass that did not require external confirmation. Alice watched her children and thought, sometimes, of the woman she had been when she stepped off the stage in Dustcreek in October of 1879, $3 and a bruise and a certainty of her own inadequacy. She thought of that woman with compassion now rather than frustration, because she understood what it meant to be diminished by sustained, deliberate effort, and how long it took to rebuild what had been taken apart. She understood it not only for herself, but for the children who came to her schoolroom, sometimes with that same particular look, the look of someone who has been told enough times that they do not matter that they have begun to believe it. And she met those children with a specific and intentional attention that came from knowing exactly what it was to be seen clearly by someone who thought you were worth seeing. She talked about it, carefully and in general terms, at the school board meeting in 1887, when there was discussion about how to handle students who were struggling. She talked about the difference between children who were incapable and children who had been taught to think of themselves as incapable, and she talked about the specific responsibility of a teacher to counteract that where it existed. Several of the board members looked thoughtful, and one of them looked uncomfortable, which she took as evidence that she had said something that landed close to something true. Daniel, who had accompanied her to the meeting as he did when she wanted him there and stayed away when she said she was fine on her own, which was most of the time, drove them home afterward through the autumn dark and said, "You had old Morrison looking like he was reconsidering several decades of assumptions." "Good," Alice said. "He should." "You're a formidable woman," he said, with the warm simplicity of someone stating a fact they admire. She looked at him in the moving dark of the wagon with the stars out and the range around them and the children asleep in the back under a blanket, and she felt the particular, specific gratitude of someone who has found the thing they had almost stopped believing in. Not the gratitude of relief, though there had been that too at the beginning. The gratitude of abundance. The recognition of what it meant to be known and loved by someone who was not diminished by your strength. "You are not so bad yourself," she said, and he reached over and found her hand in the dark and held it. The summer of 1889 brought Tommy home not just for a visit but with news. He had finished his legal studies, had been taken on by a practice in Carson City, and had fallen in love with a young woman named Clara Trent, a teacher, which delighted Alice to an extent she did not attempt to conceal. He brought Clara to the Double G in July, a straightforward, warm young woman with red hair and a direct gaze who shook Daniel's hand and asked intelligent questions about the ranch, and sat with Alice on the porch in the evening, and talked about teaching methods with the easy fluency of two people who share a calling. Alice approved of her immediately and completely. Tommy married Clara in the autumn of 1889 in the same little church with the crooked steeple, now with a new roof and a repaired spire, but still, Alice thought, the most honest-looking building in Dustcreek. She sat in the front row between Daniel and James, with a leaner on Daniel's other side, and watched the boy who had given her his uncle's forgotten arithmetic workbook and run ahead to the general store, and told Daniel to hold her hand because it was cold. She watched him become a husband with the steady, sincere gravity of a man who understood what he was doing, and she was very proud of him and did not try to hide it at all. James was 11 years old at Tommy's wedding, and carried himself with the particular dignity of a boy who has been given responsibility he takes seriously, having been tasked with managing the horses during the reception with a conscientiousness that made the adults hide their smiles. Eleanor was 5 and wore a cream dress with blue ribbon, and was observed spending the majority of the reception in conversation with the Reverend Calloway, who had baptized both her and James, and who appeared to find her excellent company. Dustcreek in 1890 was a different town from the one Alice had stepped into 11 years before. It had grown and solidified, and the dirt main road had been improved, and the buildings were sturdier, and there were more of them, and the population had trebled. Some of the things that had made it small and rough had been worn down by time, and some of the things that had made it genuine and particular had been maintained through the conscious effort of the people who had decided to make it their permanent place. Alice and Daniel were among the people who had decided that, the kind of couple that a town builds itself around without quite meaning to, present at every meeting and every gathering and every difficulty, reliable in the specific way of people who simply show up. She thought about leaving sometimes, not because she wanted to go, but in the reflective way a person thinks about the roads they did not take. She thought about the woman she might have been if she had stayed in Abilene, staying small in Calvin Howe's house, shrinking into the shape he had decided was all she was. She could not quite picture that woman because she did not recognize her anymore. She had been that woman for 2 years, but she had been herself for 11 more. And the math was now so decisively in favor of who she was that the other version had become genuinely difficult to access. She was 36 years old in the autumn of 1891. She had been teaching in Dustcreek for 12 years. She had 2 children, a husband, a nephew who came home for the holidays with his wife, and who was building a life she was proud to have had any part in shaping. She had a schoolroom and a ranch and a friendship with Francis Good that had survived 12 years of shared professional space and was only the better for it. She had Lena, always Lena, who still had her to supper twice a week, and who had become the anchor of her life in Dustcreek before anything else was possible. She had herself, which she had almost lost entirely, and which was not something she thought about every day anymore. Only occasionally, only when something reminded her of where she had come from and made the distance feel worth measuring. She sat on the porch of the Double G on a Thursday evening in October of 1891, in the year that she had been telling her students about the growth of the Nevada Territory, and the air was the clean, cold, specific air of high desert autumn, and the range stretched out before her in the late light, gold and amber and deep purple in the far shadows. The mountains were at the edge of the world, and the sky above them was beginning to turn the colors she had never seen before coming here, and now could not imagine being without. Daniel came out of the house and sat beside her and handed her a cup of coffee, and she took it, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of 12 years of building something together. The kind of silence that is not an absence of things to say, but an agreement that some things do not need saying, because they are already fully understood. Alina's voice drifted out through the open window, reading aloud, the measured and pleasurably serious tone of a child who has discovered that reading to herself is not enough and that an audience is needed. She was reading to James, who was heard intermittently making the sounds of someone who is maintaining the position that he is not listening while listening closely. Alina is going to be a writer, Alice said. She might, Daniel agreed. Or a lawyer like Tommy. She argues with a precision I find impressive. She argues with a precision that I find slightly alarming in a 7-year-old, Alice said. Daniel smiled. She gets it from somewhere. Alice looked at him sideways. I cannot imagine where. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, into the solid, warm, steady presence of him that was as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat, and still, occasionally, made her catch her breath in exactly the way it had in the beginning. She thought that was one of the things no one told you about loving a good person, that it did not diminish with familiarity. It deepened. The more you knew someone, truly knew them, the more there was to love because the knowledge kept growing and the love grew with it. Daniel, she said, he said, do you remember what you said to me on the boardwalk in November of 1879? The evening I came out of the copperpot with Harold's supper pail. He was quiet for a moment thinking. I said Marjorie Dawes had the conversational instincts of a rattlesnake. After that, he thought again. I said whoever showed you that picture was working with a flawed mirror. Yes, she said, that, I remember. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the range, at the mountains turning purple in the fading light. I was carrying so much then, she said. Everything felt like evidence. Everything confirmed what I had been told about myself, that I was more trouble than I was worth, that the people around me would be better off with me somewhere else. She paused. And then you said that, and I couldn't quite dismiss it because it came from someone who didn't yet know me well enough to be saying it for my sake, and so it had to be something you actually believed. He was listening. He was always listening. It was the first crack, she said. The first place the old version of myself let the light in. I didn't know then what it would become, but I knew something had changed. He held her a little closer. I knew something too, he said. That first Friday afternoon, when you told me grief could be a mercy and a sadness at the same time, I thought, there is a person who has thought about things, who has actually thought about what it means to lose something and not decided in advance how you were supposed to feel about it. He paused. I thought I would very much like to know you better. And now you know me very well, she said. Not all the way, he said. Not yet. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes that she had trusted for 12 years without finding a single reason to stop. Is that a project you intend to continue? She said. For the rest of my life, he said, without hesitation, without qualification, with the complete and easy certainty that she had come to understand was simply what he was like. Steady all the way down, reliable as the mountains, true in the specific, unsentimental way of someone who has never needed to perform what he already is. She kissed him there on the porch in the October evening, with the coffee getting cold between them and Alina's voice drifting through the window, and the mountains going dark against the brilliant sky. James came banging out the door approximately 30 seconds later to ask what was for supper, which Alina attributed to his complete inability to remain still for any duration, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of an ordinary evening, and Alice thought that this was what life was supposed to feel like, not the extraordinary moments, though those were real and necessary, but this, the ordinary evenings. The cold coffee and the children's voices and the man beside her whose hand found hers without either of them having to think about it. She was not a burden. She had never been a burden. She was a woman who had been broken down and had rebuilt herself, piece by careful piece, with the help of someone who had never flinched at the work of it, who had simply looked at what was there and decided it was worth every bit of the care. The winter of 1891 settled over Dustcreek, and the double G with the same even permanence it always did. The snow coming and the fires burning, and the long evenings full of lamplight and books, and the small, sustaining rituals of a household that was a home in every real sense of the word. Tommy and Clara came for Christmas, and it was discovered that Clara was expecting their first child. News received with the particular delight of a family that knows what it means to welcome someone new into the world. Eleanor demanded to know when the baby would arrive, and upon being told the following summer nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a hypothesis. Alice sat at the table on Christmas evening with the people she loved arranged around her, and thought about the 10-year-old girl she had once been, sitting at her mother's kitchen table in Abilene while her mother read aloud, and she thought about how that girl had grown up believing, because her mother believed it without qualification, that she was worth something, that she had things to offer the world, that her presence in a room was not a subtraction but an addition. And then she thought about the years when she had forgotten that, when someone had persuaded her it was not true, and then about the slow and imperfect and ultimately triumphant process of remembering. She looked at Daniel across the table, who was listening to Tommy recount a case from his legal practice with the focused interest of someone who genuinely wants to understand how other people's work operates, and he looked up at the exact moment she looked at him, the way he often did, and his eyes held for just a moment before he returned to Tommy, and in that moment was everything. 12 years of everything. She thought, I came here with $3 and a bruise, and the belief that I was too much trouble for the world to want. And the world, in the form of this town, and this man and this life, had met that belief with the quiet and persistent and ultimately overwhelming evidence of its opposite. She picked up James's fork from the floor where he had dropped it, handed Eleanor the bread basket when she reached for it, refilled Daniel's coffee from the pot on the table, and rejoined the conversation with the ease of someone who is entirely, freely, unambiguously at home. The crooked steeple of the church was visible through the window from where she sat, just a dark shape against the winter sky, the same shape that had been above her and Daniel on the day they said the words that changed everything. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at the room around her, and she thought, with a fullness that had no room in it for the old weight, for the old diminishment, for any of the words that had once been used to make her small, this is mine, not as property, as belonging. This is where I belong, and I belong here completely, and there is not a single piece of me that is a burden to anyone in this room. She heard Daniel's voice, warm and engaged, answering Tommy's question. She heard Eleanor explaining something with grave authority to James, who was eating and pretending not to listen. She heard Clara's laughter at something Tommy had said, easy and genuine. She heard the fire and the wind outside, and the settling of the house that had become her house in every way that mattered. And Alice Garrison, who was now and would always be Alice Garrett, who had once been told without words, and then with them that she was more trouble than she was worth, who had left a city with $3 and a bruise and a determination not to disappear, who had walked into a small Nevada town in October of 1879 and been met by something she had almost stopped believing in, which was the particular grace of a person who simply sees you clearly and finds what they see worth keeping. Alice Garrett set down her coffee cup and looked at the faces of the people who were her life, and felt the thing she had earned and chosen and built and been given, felt it completely and without reservation. She was home. She was whole. She was, in every way that could be counted and in several that could not, exactly where she was supposed to be. The snow fell outside the windows of the double G, and the light was warm inside, and somewhere out on the range the cattle were steady in the winter dark, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, and the life Alice Garrison had built on the other side of the hardest years of her existence continued, full and real and hers.